Good day, everyone. Welcome to the Just Us Coordinating Council Speaker Series. My name is Zach Ruppel. I use he, him pronouns, and I serve as a policy analyst for Just Leadership USA. And I'm honored to be with you today as moderator for what will be a dynamic and empowering conversation as part of the Just Us Coordinating Council's Federal Speaker Series. The JCC, as many of you know, is the first of its kind national policy table created by and for individuals impacted by the criminal legal system. And over the course of the last year and a half, we've built a table where everyone is welcome and all who are invited have a seat. This is a table where collectively we can leverage our lived experience as the expertise that it is. Today's speaker series features representatives from the Federal Trade Commission and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. We are thrilled to have them, and these experts will be highlighting critical federal resources and consumer protections to support directly impacted families and individuals as they engage in our economy. And by enforcing these protections, we not only reclaim the power of our civil rights, we also help lay the foundation for future policymaking. So I'm joined today by our speakers, Jared Brown and Whitney Moore from the FTC's Division of Privacy and Identity Protection, as well as Shana Vanek, a senior policy analyst with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And I'd like to say welcome to each of you, and we look forward to hearing from you. But before we dive into today's session, I wanted to take just a few moments to orient those of you or reorient those who are joining us again more about exactly why the JCC is the first of its kind approach to policy. Next slide, please, David. So as I mentioned, in April of 2023, the Just Us Coordinating Council was launched. The JCC is a national federal policy table that is led by and created for individuals who are directly impacted. It is one of the first of its kind in the sense of a national collective that is led by systems impacted leaders, community members, and national organizations who no longer demand a seat at the table, but instead we're building our own. Next slide, please. So why? You'll see on your screen our why is quite simply that the voices of those most impacted by the criminal legal system are usually missing or excluded from decision-making tables. And because of that, most of the individuals experiencing what we know as that persistent relationship between poverty and mass incarceration are often furthest away to bring that solution in the form of resources and powers to advance positive change. So shifting the status quo means investing in the leadership of those of us who are directly impacted so that we can move toward impacting the criminal legal system and stand alongside them to propel change. Our theory of change is based on building relationships and thought partnerships within the federal government, within federal staff, and of course, those that are appointed to make sure that we are able to bring our voices as directly impacted persons to their departmental initiatives and to policymaking. Next slide, please. So to adequately start addressing the harms caused by the criminal legal system, the JCC works to create pathways, access, and resources within each of these policy areas that you see on the screen in front of you. And we know that it will take a whole of government approach to really address this whole of person approach to reentry and navigating the collateral consequences that come with a criminal conviction. Next slide, please. And so today we are highlighting rights and protections, which is something that impacts all aspects of reentry. And they're often not either fully realized or not fully enforced by persons with lived experience. Impact from that criminal legal system does not, however, strip away our rights as consumers. These rights can help us reclaim our power in the pushback against systemic barriers. Our mission is to enhance quality of life, and we do that partly by raising the rights that we do have as directly impacted persons, with a key focus on dispelling myths, highlighting facts, and connecting all of us as members of the JCC to the resources that we need. Next slide, please. With all things, we are always centering back to the table. We are centering back to the people, and we are centering back to where the rubber meets the road in communities. Today's session centers on those most impacted as we highlight some of these policies and resources, explore opportunities where we can share these resources and advocate in our community, and of course, connect with the federal partners who are with us today. So I am thrilled to welcome to the stage Shana Vanek, as I mentioned, who is a senior policy analyst with the CFPB. And we are looking forward to learning from you, Shana. Since its inception in 2011, the CFPB has helped put over $20 billion, that's billion with a B, folks, back in the pockets of consumers, including those directly impacted. So here to share more about her work and how we can enforce our rights through this bureau is Shana Vanek. Shana, we look forward to learning from you. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Zach. And I love that we're talking about federal partners and standing together, because so much of this work can't be done in a vacuum or by one person, but by a collective. And I'm really, really pleased to be here with the JCC today. Just Leadership USA has been near and dear to my heart for many, many years since its inception. And I'm just thrilled to be able to be here and share some of the resources we have at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And in my role, which, as Zach said, is a senior policy analyst, and my focus is on all things JII, justice involved, justice impacted people. So I feel like I'm with my colleagues here. But being from the federal government, you probably can guess there has to be a disclaimer. There's always a disclaimer. And it's important for me to say that all of the views that I'm going to express today are my own and not necessarily representative of that of the CFPB. So with that, I will jump right in and go to the next slide. So I don't know how many people on this call today know what CFPB is. So we are a 21st century agency that implements and enforces federal consumer financial law and ensures that the markets for consumer products, financial products specifically, are fair, transparent, and competitive. Full disclosure, I am not an attorney, nor am I an economist, but I am somebody who's worked in the criminal legal system and on behalf of those who work in it and live in it for over 25 years. So my views are a little different, but I think will be advantageous to the work and, quite frankly, to the conversation today. So next slide. So our mission is really pretty simple. It's to make financial markets work for people, responsible providers, and the economy as a whole. So when markets are fair and they're competitive and people know their rights, everything works better. We really need to and want to protect consumers from unfair, deceptive, or abusive acts or practices. So this again links back to knowing your rights and taking action against those companies that break the law. And then lastly, but certainly not least, is equipping people with the information, steps, and tools that they need to make smart financial decisions. So that's really at the core of who we are and what we do, is helping people to have the knowledge and the power to make those good decisions and to know what to do when things go wrong, and who to complain to and what to do about that. Because knowing your rights gives you a great deal of power, even against the big guys. So next slide. So this is an important piece that I think fits in really well with the JCC. So thinking about what your input does and can have, the influence it can have on policy, is really critical. So I know we talk a lot about consumer rights and focusing in on individual rights, but when we as an agency at CFPB understand and are able to have a kind of a greater picture of understanding of how different products hurt people, that helps us to influence and then change policy. So what we know about is what we're able to change. What we don't know about, obviously, is that much harder. So I want to talk a little bit about the core tenet of not just how I operate, but how CFPB operates. We are really in a relationship building feedback loop. And you'll see this with some of the things that Zach will share at the end of our session today as well, just one example. But we work directly with stakeholder organizations like Just Leadership, the JCC, with other advocacy groups, with other policymakers, with those that are practicing law, that are protecting consumers, also those that are practitioners in the field of corrections. All of those people help us to understand the bigger picture. And so a engagement happens of some kind. I'll tell a bit more about those in a few minutes. And you connect with somebody at CFPB, somebody like me. You help to highlight an emerging trend or a market issue that is something that we may or may not have heard of before. Things like fees that are associated with prepaid cards. You'll see me talk about that in a little bit. And when that happens, we then, refer it to its appropriate bureau staff, and then we can possibly take action upon it, particularly when there's more than one complaint or more than one person or entity raising these issues. So it really does help to understand the big picture and your role in that, as a stakeholder organization or as a stakeholder person, consumer. Both of those avenues are open to you. So that really helps. And I would say that it also is a matter of, like I said, giving us a channel for enforcement, because once we know of key issues that do arise, we are able to take action accordingly. Next slide. Okay, so how does that actually work? This chart really illustrates the mechanism by which organizations can influence policy at the Bureau. And so in terms of, like I said, filing complaint, or encouraging others to file a complaint, this is one of those areas where it's not just putting a complaint into the abyss, but it's putting a complaint in that helps us to help you exercise your rights. So if you're having an issue with a financial product, we're in a position to be able to help encourage that company to respond to you and to get it resolved. And that can, like I said, be through complaint process, that can be through roundtables or listening sessions, ongoing discussions. Like I said, that helps us define the problem and really helps us not just to define the problem, but the impact it has on people. And that in turn informs policymaking. So that's kind of the short version of the magic that happens behind the curtain. Next slide. And so an example of that, which I think would be of interest, is an example of where we've held bad actors accountable. And that has been through example that I have here on the slide, which shows that we gathered information about justice impacted people while they're incarcerated, had filed complaints with us or shortly thereafter about their problems with JPay to get their prepaid cards. And so what we found was that JPay forced consumers to have a prepaid card as a condition of their release. So for their gate money. So basically everything that was in commissary, everything that was, sent in by loved ones, all of those pieces of financial support were then put on a prepaid card for gate money. And consumers were offered no other choice but to have that prepaid card. And that prepaid card had fees for using it, fees for not using it, fees for inactivity, fees for using an ATM. And so ultimately, that resulted in an enforcement action that ordered JPay to stop charging fees on release cards, except for inactivity of fees of over 90 days, and required them to pay about $6 million in both consumer redress and also penalties. So that's a real life example of where those consumer complaints and those financial harms impacted people. And then we were able to do something very specific and meaningful about it, including issuing guidance. And so I don't fall too far behind schedule. Next slide. Here I just have a number of newsroom articles. You'll be able to access these links in the deck once the session's over. But I think what's really important is CFPB has paid a lot of attention to traditionally a underrepresented and vulnerable consumer group. When, people who've been involved with the justice system don't feel like there's a place or a space to have their concerns heard, that's problematic. And so CFPB has highlighted kind of with the report in January 2022, which you'll see is the first item. That report showed where all of these financial harms, from everything from arrest and pre-sentence through incarceration, through pre-release and back into the community, the entire criminal legal system has places and spaces where consumers are harmed, both those who are directly involved with the justice system and those that are indirectly involved with the criminal justice legal system, family members and friends. So I think having that perspective, you all have lived it. Many people who work in the system or who are involved more broadly may not be aware of all of these places of harm. So we thought it was really important to shine a spotlight on that, quite frankly, and really show that those financial products and services often contain exploitive or terms or features, and often offer no or very limited consumer choice and have very, very long-term negative consequences on people. So We've also had a number of news cases. I mentioned the JPay case and the decision there, as well as the guidance that we issued broadly to people who were companies, rather not people, who were providing prepaid cards. So you can take a look at those at your leisure, but know that your experiences and those of your friends and your family and of consumers every day, they matter and they are heard and they result in action by our agency. Next slide. Alrighty, so there's a few slides here we have about a document or a resource, I will call it, because it really is more than just a document. And many of you have seen this. I know that it's on the Jail USA JCC website already, but we have a specific guide for people who are both incarcerated or going through release, but also, quite frankly, the people who are working in correctional facilities or working in the community to help people with the criminal convictions. So this reentry guide is designed to help facilitate frontline staff, volunteers, pretty much anybody who's working with individuals with criminal records, address some of the very specific financial challenges that may be faced. And I would say, as much as it's designed for kind of those frontline folks to work with people with criminal records, I think it's really handy for yourselves too. You don't necessarily need to have a guide taking you through, but having very, very user-friendly documents and handouts and tools, basically, that you can go through and utilize when you come up with a particular financial question or a problem. And I would say that's really, really kind of what this guide is about. Next slide. And I'll unpack it a little bit with you. There's 10 different modules, and each of these modules addresses a particular financial issue. It's not a curriculum. It's not something that somebody has to go through module by module. But if you were interested in, understanding your background screening report, I'm guessing that might be an area of interest. And so there's a module on that, and it gives you a checklist of key things that you can go through and do to not just understand what it looks like, why it is the way it is, but then also what you can do to correct errors, what you can do to get copies of from all the different places that might have information that lends itself into that criminal background screening report. So next slide. And another example I wanted to make sure I highlighted was getting documents and identification. You all know, you've experienced, and probably colleagues and friends and loved ones have experienced the challenges of getting a job or applying for benefits, getting a bank account, keeping that bank account open, all of the issues that require identification documents. So having somebody or a tool that can help you kind of go through and find all those documents is really critical, particularly so that it's one less barrier, or at least a navigatable barrier post-release. So that's one. And next slide, if you would. Also wanted to share a quick handout, kind of where to get information, where to pull this information from. There are, as many of you have experienced, I know that we were in a session, probably, goodness, last spring, where trying to find where all of these documents are. You may get a copy of your criminal record, but my goodness, what goes into that is from everywhere. It's from, state and local police. It's from the state criminal records authority. It could be from the FBI. It could be from federal court. It could be misinformation that's just been repeated again and again. It could be from a media article that found a name that was very similar or the same as yours. And then it turns into something that gets associated with your criminal record when it had nothing to do with you. And those are the things that I think, being able to go back, as challenging as it often is for people who've been touched by the legal system, to kind of have to feel like they're reliving that. I don't want you to feel like you're reliving it. You're fact gathering. You are protecting your own individual records. You are verifying that they are in fact true. Oftentimes, you may have been charged with 15 different things, but only prosecuted for one. Those 15 different things can make your criminal record look much more full than it otherwise would. So really making sure that you're verifying all the information, as difficult as it may be to relive it briefly. Making sure it's accurate matters, because it impacts, as you all know, employment, jobs, housing, pretty much everything that we all do in the world these days has information about us. And so making sure that information is accurate is really, really critical. Um, and then, once you have those records, working towards expungement, working towards, other court or legal ways, I guess is the way to put it. See, non-attorney, legal ways to reduce and remove convictions from your past. So that way, again, you're able to not have that in your background. So those are all viable paths to not only obtain information, but then what to do with it and about it once you have it. Next slide. And then I know this will come up in later conversation as well, but this is just one example of a tool that can help you to request your own background screening report. Like I said, check it for errors, dispute issues that you do see on there, and knowing your rights and protections when it comes to that information that's on your background screening report is so critical. Kind of knowing what to do if you receive an adverse action. So if you apply for a job and you were denied that job, and what can you get afterwards? What was it that made them make that decision? Was it at the gate when you were, right in the front door when you're walking in and applying for the job, and have that background come up because they don't have a ban the box? So kind of what are your rights and opportunities to make sure that you're protecting yourself and that you are given a fair shot at any employment that you were looking for? And then, like I said, where to find help when you're not in this by yourself. You can do all the fact finding and all the gathering yourself, but when it comes to like what are the next steps if you get stuck, knowing where to go for that. And this really helps you figure out, can you seal part of your record? Can you expunge part of your record? There are a lot of organizations out there that help with that, and so, but knowing where you're starting is really an important and critical spot. And so ultimately, I would say that CFPB, although we have some materials that are going to be very helpful to you and give you tools that can help you navigate through, and colleagues and friends that may be leaving incarceration, to be able to share these with them. I'm all for it and would strongly encourage it. But we're one agency amongst many that really does work to support and protect consumer rights and all of the pieces that come with it. And so I'm really happy that my colleagues are with me here today from FTC. And I think this is the end of my deck. So I'm going to ask for next slide and see if that is in fact true. It is.
Thank you, Shana. And before we move on to your colleagues with the Federal Trade Commission, I just want to dig into a couple points that you made that I think were just fabulous, and I really appreciate you raising them. At the very beginning of your presentation, you mentioned your work currently and previously within the criminal legal system and those that it impacts. So both from that vantage point and just through your time at the Bureau, I guess I'm curious, you've already mentioned, JPay and some others, but I'm curious where else you have seen this intersect, and particularly criminal legal specific issues that CFPB has been able to really start taking a look at systemically. Are there others that you would highlight for us?
Sure. I mean, I think, this is one of my mantras that I say probably more often that it becomes beyond a mantra. I don't know what that is when you do that. But I think that every single consumer issue has a component that is more challenging, or at least a little different when it comes to somebody who has been involved with the criminal legal system. I think that thread needs to be woven through every single action, activity, the way we think about things at CFPB, so critical. So I'm thinking about, for example, medical debt. We do a lot of work in the medical debt space at CFPB. We've been looking into it for some time. There's been plenty of news articles and requests for information, everything in between. And knowing, as I do from my previous federal employment as well as here at CFPB, there is a uniquely different part about medical debt when it comes to people who've been incarcerated, from the fees and the things that are associated from while you're incarcerated to potentially having, a criminal justice corrections agency release you just long enough to get medical treatment and then bring you back in. And then that gets charged elsewhere, possibly to you as the consumer. So I think those are the things that, again, people who don't have lived experience with the system or have worked in the system even they don't know what happens. It's just this big mystery. And so I think those of you who've had that direct experience know that the harms are there, just like they are for every other consumer, but they're bigger and they're more impactful. And the barriers they create after release are that much harder to overcome.
Mm.
So I think that's a really good example of where those worlds intersect, and wherever we can, weave that thread in to build the broader quilt of consumer protection. I want that JI thread in there every step of the way.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for that. You mentioned a phrase at the beginning, is that we can't fix what we don't know. And I think
Mhm.
I think that's huge. And that really, both last month with EEOC, OSHA, and Wage and Hours, and now this month with FTC and CFPB, we're really trying to instill into folks, we need to submit when these things happen so that those of you that are in this space can, in fact, provide that support and then potentially that relief as well. I guess to that end, I'm curious, from your vantage point, where you have seen some of these complaints that come in, they become enforcement. Now the CFPB understands this is an issue. Now we're going to dig in from the policy lens. How have you
Mhm.
seen some of those complaints influence it on the policy making side after the fact?
That's a really good example. I think JPay is probably the best case, because it's
Okay.
kind of gone full cycle, if you will. Um, but I think the biggest challenge that I noticed when I came into CFPB a couple of years ago was that we weren't always able to see the number of complaints that came from justice impacted individuals.
Mm,
And I say that because we don't have a drop down menu when you're filing a complaint that says, hey, I've been involved with the legal system.
right.
And that's a good thing because it's not further stigmatizing, but it's a bad thing because then I can't identify which complaints are specific to JI without reading every single one of them, which by the
Sure.
way, we do because we don't get that many of them. I want to have that problem of having so many that we can't read through them all, or I can't,
Exactly.
one person can't. So I think that's the space where, thinking your voice doesn't matter, that one complaint doesn't matter. It absolutely does, because it was because of probably about, I'm going to guesstimate, about 200 plus complaints that came in specific to JPay, that
Wow.
started following the thread. And it was not just from
Mm,
people who were currently incarcerated or had been released, but about from family members. And so knowing that we are part of a broader community, and that, when something happens to one of us, it happens to all of us. I think that's one of those key things to remember, because when somebody puts a complaint in, it's not just that one person. It keeps adding up and building enough that it tips the scale for us to know at CFPB, oh, geez, we need to look at this a little bit more deeply, and start asking the right questions, and start looking at, the financial institutions that these companies are, and understanding how they operate. So I think
mm.
that was the prime example. There are other current engagements that I'm not able to speak about, but know that your complaints and the issues that are raised in listening sessions, et cetera, are absolutely critical to our understanding. And that's why we keep asking more and more questions and asking you to every single table that we're at.
Absolutely. Thank you. Thank you so much. And I will flag a couple of things that Shana just shared. The first is the impact on families, particularly for some of these carceral related bad actors, if you will, and that the consumer experience on either side of this particular issue is relevant and is something that absolutely can and should be part of this complaint process. Because it's really important that speaking, if I may, for the CFPB, I believe that it is very important that you're also seeing this from a 365 degree in terms of the impact on not just the person, but also the entire support system, the home, the community. And I know that for the JCC, those are exactly the types of innovations and resources that we want to funnel back up to the federal government so that we can help you all understand where there's opportunity here. So yeah, this is fabulous. I'm noting in the comments a couple of folks really interested in how we can start submitting complaints. So that's good. We've hit a goal here. And I know, Shana, we'll have you back here in about 25 minutes or so to share more about the complaint tool. And folks that are curious about that, she's going to walk us through that with a little bit more particularities. So hang tight. But for now, Shana, thank you so much for your overview and some of those great resources. And I can also personally say that each time I share a CFPB resource with my colleagues and personal network here in Ohio, they continue to be amazed at just how many protections exist and for the breadth of consumer related issues that there really are a lot of protections for. Long before the CFPB was created, however, another agency stood squarely in the space of protecting consumers and continues that work today. And this is the Federal Trade Commission, which began serving consumers in 1915 and to this day provides that same essential enforcement work, educational programs, and policy development that ensures fair business practices and consumer protections, including within the realm of one of the most essential documents that Shana already highlighted for those of us with lived experience, and that is the background check. So here to dig in more, share some myths and facts, to share more about their work and some very important information are Jared Brown and Whitney Moore, enforcement attorneys with the FTC's Division of Privacy and Identity Protection. Thank you both for being here. The floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. As Zach said, I'm Jared Brown. My colleague Whitney Moore and I are both attorneys at the Federal Trade Commission. In addition to our division, Privacy and Identity Protection, we're also part of the Bureau of Consumer Protection. And we want to talk to you a little bit today about what the FTC does to protect consumers, both generally, but then also drill down on some of our work and tips that specifically relate to credit reporting and background screening, which is so important to all of us, but this community in particular. Before I dig in, I do have to add the disclaimer: the views we express today are our own. They don't necessarily reflect those of the FTC or any one of its commissioners. And I'll also note for folks looking at the slides we prepared today, we tried to provide some quick tips. These are, the rough kind of paraphrased version of some of the information we're going to be talking about. At the end of the presentation, we'll highlight some specific guidance that's a little more careful. So just keep that in mind if you're looking at the slides. These are definitely reference materials. Highly recommend actually going to sort of the truth of the more substantive guidance that we have out there for you, which we'll highlight at the end. Next slide, please. So who is the FTC? The FTC is an independent law enforcement agency. We're a civil law enforcement agency. We don't have the ability to bring any criminal charges or put anyone in jail. So our primary tools are lawsuits and civil enforcement mechanisms. The FTC actually has two missions. We're both responsible for protecting consumers and also for promoting competition. Next slide, please. I wanted to give you a little illustration of how the agency is organized for folks who want to understand it better. We're led by a 5-person commission. The law says that no more than 3 of the commissioners can be of the same party. The current chair of the commission is Lena Khan. I've got the rest of the commissioners here listed for folks who are interested, but I won't take your time to list them all right now. Underneath the commission, we have some bureaus and other offices. First, I have up here the Bureau of Consumer Protection. That's where Whitney and I work. There's also a Bureau of Competition that's responsible for that competition mission of the agency. For example, a really obvious example of their work is suing companies to block them from merging, for example, where the merger would be anti-competitive. The agency also has a Bureau of Economics that's staffed by economists that support the work of both the bureaus and make sure our work is informed by economic principles. And we have a number of other offices, like our Office of International Affairs and Office of Congressional Relations. The agency also has 8 regional offices spread around the country, and those are staffed by attorneys, investigators, and others who are performing both consumer protection and competition work, and they report up to the bureaus. Next slide, please. The FTC has broad jurisdiction over acts in the nation's commerce. Our work really touches on almost every consumer. We do have some limitations on our authority, however. In particular, we don't have authority over banks, insurance companies, nonprofits, and transportation and communications companies, and some others. The statute that created us and which gives us our main tools is the Federal Trade Commission Act, or FTC Act. And the heart of the FTC Act is Section 5A, which empowers the agency to investigate and prevent unfair methods of competition and also unfair or deceptive acts or practices affecting commerce. The FTC Act gives us the ability to seek relief for consumers. Our main tool is getting injunctions to stop unlawful practices. In some cases, we're also able to get money back for consumers or monetary civil penalties from wrongdoers. Next slide, please. Now let me drill down a little bit more on the work of our Bureau, the Bureau of Consumer Protection. We work in the Bureau to stop fraud, deception, and unfair business practices, as well as protect all communities from these bad business practices. And here's how we do it. Our primary tool is enforcement. The FTC investigates companies for possible violations, which can be based off reports we receive from consumers or other information, and we sue companies that we think have broken the law. We also do a lot of consumer and business education and outreach. For example, we'll tell people about their rights, and we'll also inform businesses about their responsibilities. The Commission and the Bureau also have the ability to issue rules. For example, right now, the Commission is considering whether to issue a final rule that would prohibit some forms of hidden and deceptive fees. And the agency also has other kinds of policy work. We hold workshops to learn about new areas. We'll conduct studies and issue reports based off our research. Next slide, please. This slide shows you the structure of the Bureau of Consumer Protection, which is actually made up of 8 divisions that handle different subject matters, led by our director, Sam Levine. If you see down here, there's 5 what we call litigating and investigating divisions, which includes our division, the Privacy and Identity Protection. We handle privacy and data security cases, consumer reports, and generally how companies are using consumer data. We also have divisions, for example, advertising practices that handles false advertising and unsubstantiated health claims, whereas our marketing practice division handles more things like fraud. In addition to the litigating divisions, we have several others. We have a consumer and business education division and some other divisions that support our work, like consumer response, which actually receives and analyzes the reports from consumers. Next slide, please. This slide shows some examples of the many other consumer protection statutes and rules that the FTC also enforces in addition to the FTC Act. We actually enforce more than 50 other consumer protection statutes. One example is the Fair Debt Collection Practices Act, which we share enforcement with the CFPB. That law protects consumers from abusive debt collection practices, like setting limits on when and how a debt collector can contact a consumer about a debt. And another important one that we're going to talk a little bit more about is the Fair Credit Reporting Act. In addition, on the right side, you see some images here of some of the rules that we actually enforce too. For example, our Made in the USA rule sets requirements that products must meet to be labeled as having been made in the USA. Next slide, please. So now I want to drill down in some of our work and tips we've developed from our experience enforcing the Fair Credit Reporting Act, which we like to call the FCRA. Some folks prefer to call it FCRA, so apologies if I jump into calling it FCRA here. That's what we tend to use in the Bureau. The FCRA is the federal law that sets requirements for companies that provide credit and background checks, and covers how and when companies can use people's credit and background information to make eligibility determinations about things like loans, housing, and employment, among others. It requires notice to consumers in certain circumstances, as well as it requires consumer reporting agencies, which can be both the big credit bureaus you are probably familiar with, as well as all the background check companies, to only provide a consumer report if there's a permissible purpose for them to do so. Unfortunately, and this is a point of confusion we've heard, although the consumer reporting agencies, or CRAs, we sometimes call them, although they need a purpose to provide a report on you, they aren't required to get your consent to aggregate and create that file about you. We're almost all part of this ecosystem, whether we agree to it or not. One of the most important requirements in the FCRA is that the consumer reporting agencies must have reasonable procedures for maximum possible accuracy of the records they report about you. The records they report need to contain accurate and up-to-date information, and they need to match the right records to the right consumer. Now, I'm going to talk, and then Whitney after me is going to talk about the protections of the federal FCRA. State and local laws may provide additional protections, so it's a good idea to learn about those if you can. Next slide, please. One of the challenges we've heard about that comes up in this consumer reporting space is that it's confusing what rights you have when you're dealing with a credit report versus a background check, either a tenant or an employment background check. So I wanted to spend a little time highlighting key differences between each of these types of reports right now. The first point of confusion is consent. I just told you that CRAs don't need your consent to gather data about you, but when do they need your consent to provide a report about you to someone else? In the case of credit reports, they typically don't. In most cases, they'll have a basis to issue a report about you that does not require your explicit consent. This is also the case in tenant background checks. The statute does not require consent. Employment is different. In employment, you do need to consent to that background check in writing. But as many of you likely know, that doesn't mean the employer has to consider your application if you decline. Next slide, please. Who is providing the consumer report in each of these areas? For credit reports, it's going to be the big three credit bureaus in most cases. You're talking Experian, Equifax, or TransUnion, or a smaller player called Innovis. It's very different in the tenant and employment background check space. Here, there are hundreds of companies, and that creates a lot of logistical challenges for you. Next slide, please. What is in these reports? For credit reports, it often includes a credit score, as well as information on your credit history, debts, and any bankruptcies. Tenant and employment background checks are going to contain a lot more info. Typically, both of these may include a credit report, so they'll have everything that's in the credit report too. They may also include work or income history. Both will typically include criminal history. Employment background checks may include education history. And tenant background checks often include housing court records, like evictions, as well as occasionally rent payment history. Both tenant and employment background checks may also include a score or a recommendation to the landlord or employer. And this is something that they're not required to give you in a file disclosure, unfortunately. Next slide, please. This is another big difference between these areas logistically more than anything else. What if you want to see what's in your report now? You're not waiting until you've been denied. You want to check it right now before you're applying. For credit reports, it's pretty simple. You go to annualcreditreport.com. You can get a report right now for once a week for free from each of the three credit bureaus at that site. The credit bureaus also must make a current credit score available for a fee. On the tenant and employment background checks, it's much different. These companies are required to give you a copy of all the information in their files if you contact them, and that's called a file disclosure. But there are hundreds of these companies, so figuring out who to ask can be difficult, if not impossible in some cases. In addition, many of these companies may purchase info about you only when a landlord or employer asks about it. When they actually ask for a background check, they'll purchase the info at that time. That means if you contact them ahead of time to ask for your file, they may not have any information yet and tell you your file is clean. So it can be misleading, leading to challenges in this area. Next slide, please. A few other important differences to highlight. The credit reports are more likely, at least compared to tenant background and employment background checks, to be consistent across the major credit bureaus. If I jump over to employment, one of the unique rights in the employment space is that before an employer denies you a job or otherwise takes an adverse action against you based on something in your background check, the employer must provide a notice of that fact to you and a copy of your report for you to review. Unfortunately, the FCRA does not require them to hold the job open for you while you dispute any errors. In the tenant background checks, they don't have that requirement to give you a copy of the report. They do have to give you notice that they're taking an adverse action based on something in the report, but unfortunately the law says that can be electronic, in writing, or orally. So it's very important in the tenant space, particularly, to make sure you get the information on who the background check company is and how to contact them so you can get a copy and review it for any errors. With this overview of some of the key differences, I'm going to hand it over to Whitney, who's going to talk more about other attributes of consumer reporting and tips.
Thanks so much, Jared. Can we have the next slide, please? So in addition to the provisions that Jared just talked about, the FCRA also limits how long some records can be reported on your credit or your background check. So generally speaking, most negative information is limited to 7 years. And that includes negative financial information, for example, late payments or collections. It includes arrest records, negative rental history, things like missed or late rent payments, and housing court and eviction records. It also includes cases that were resolved in your favor. So this is one of those things that I think is sometimes confusing. But if it's a dismissed eviction case, if it's a dismissed criminal case, if it's an arrest that didn't go anywhere, that can still be reported for 7 years. It just can't be reported past that point. One exception to this 7-year requirement is bankruptcies. Bankruptcies can be reported for 10 years, and criminal convictions are another exception. The FCRA allows background check companies to report criminal convictions forever. Another thing to note, though, is that these are FCRA limitations on reporting information. So these are limitations that apply nationally, but there are a number of local jurisdictions that have imposed stricter, I guess lower time limitations would be a better way to put it, on negative records. And so in particular, there are a lot of local jurisdictions that limit how far back a landlord or an employer is allowed to look for criminal and eviction records. And so it's definitely worth checking where you live to see if there's stricter limits there. And if you aren't sure where to start, there are probably local legal aid groups in most areas who can help you point you to that information, or even help you sort of parse it to see how it might apply to you. Next slide, please. And so now that we've talked about some of the provisions of the FCRA and some key differences in the various types of background checks, we wanted to walk you through some practical tips for background check issues that might come up. The first thing is, before you apply for housing or even a loan or employment, if you know that you have records that are eligible to be sealed or expunged, try to do that as soon as you can. The CFPB has actually said that sealed and expunged records should not appear on a background check at all. There's been one court that has disagreed with that, but even there, and it was a district court, I think, in Georgia. But even there, the court noted that the record had been sealed or expunged, and it was reported as expunged. And so even if the record's being reported, it has to indicate that it's been expunged or it's been sealed. And many, I think what we've seen just in sort of public statements on it is that there are a lot of background check companies who just remove these records. They don't want to report the record and note that it's expunged. They just don't report it. So either way, it's really best to pursue sealing or expunging any records that are eligible for it. And one thing to keep in mind about that is that if you were pardoned, that is not the same thing as the records being sealed or expunged. So it's worth going through the process of trying to seal or expunge the records as well, if that's an option that's available to you. Next is, again, before you apply for credit or housing or employment, consider requesting a free copy of your background report. As Jared noted earlier, you can get a copy of your credit report through annualcreditreport.com for free. That's going to allow you to get copies from all of the big three that do provide those credit reports. And then there's typically I think typically there's going to be a fair amount of consistency in the information that all three are reporting. So, there may occasionally be mistakes that appear on one of them that wouldn't appear on the other two. But often if there's a mistake on one, that mistake is going to be on all three. And so looking at that credit report before you apply for a loan can allow you to identify issues and get them cleaned up. In terms of applying for employment or housing, I think, as Jared also noted earlier, there are many different companies that provide those background checks, and there can be a fair amount of difference in what they report because of the way that they get their records. And so if you know that the landlord or the employer uses a particular screening company, then you can ask that company for a free copy of your report in advance. But if you don't know which one they're using, we still think it's worth it to consider requesting a free copy from one of the large national screening companies so that you can at least preview what they have. That might allow you to see how records about you are being reported. So if you spot errors there, you can try to get them fixed before you actually apply. This is particularly useful if the error is in the underlying court record. So not necessarily a mistake that the background check company is making, but a mistake in the underlying record. So for example, a court record in an eviction proceeding that doesn't show that the judgment was satisfied. That could indicate that the landlord never filed that notice with the court. And so you know that you need to get the landlord to file that notice before you apply for housing. This could also be a useful way to see if any old landlords are reporting inaccurate information about your rental payment history. If so, then you can get that cleaned up before you're in position for the report to actually be important to your application. And getting those kinds of errors cleaned up, it's a good idea just to get them cleaned up generally, because you don't know when you might need to apply for something and have them correct. And something to keep in mind is that many of those companies aren't maintaining their own databases of records. And so I think Jared flagged this, that they just buy records each time they need to generate a new report. So if you ask them for a copy of your report and they say, oh, we don't have any records on you, and then you apply for a job or for an apartment the next week and they suddenly provide a report that has records about you, it doesn't mean that they were lying. It's just that sometimes because they don't maintain a database, they have to receive an order to get a report on you, and then they go get those records and put them on a report. So all of that sort of just means that checking a free background report from one of the national background check companies is a good step. It's just not a foolproof one. But we do think on the whole, it's probably a good idea to do it if you have time. And then one more before you apply tip that is particular to housing applications. Before you apply for rental housing, if you are concerned about things in your record, like if you know that you were sued for eviction last year, or that there's, that you have been incarcerated and you have only been out for a little while, and you're concerned about whether that's going to be an issue when you apply, consider asking the landlord for their screening criteria in advance. Some landlords may refuse to rent to people who have a certain credit score or recent evictions, or who have certain criminal records. They're not allowed to have a blanket ban on any criminal record, but they will sometimes have particular provisions about recent or particular types of criminal records. So if you know what those criteria are in advance, then you can avoid paying application fees unnecessarily. So I think one of the things that we hear a lot from people who are applying for rental housing is that they didn't know that the landlord was going to disqualify them because, say they were sued for eviction 2 years ago, and so they paid the application fee, and then the landlord didn't even consider it because of that eviction filing. The fees can add up, and so trying to avoid paying the fees for an apartment that you don't think you're going to qualify for is often helpful. And then a tip for when you are actually at the point of filling out the application for housing or employment is to remember that the landlord or the employer is going to use the information that you put on your application to run the background check. And so making sure that you give them the most complete and accurate identifying information is going to increase the likelihood that the background check doesn't include someone else's records. So for example, if you don't have a middle name and there's a place on the application to check no middle name, do that. Don't just leave the middle name field blank. If your name is John Robert Smith, put Robert as your middle name. Don't just leave that blank, because you don't want to wind up with John David Smith's criminal records on your report. This, I think, it's one of those things where like if you give them more information about your sort of identifying characteristics, like your name, your social security number, that just gives them more points to try to match. And so what you're trying to do is minimize the chance that the wrong records are going to be on your report. So this has all been about sort of what you should think about doing either before or as you apply. But if you apply and something negative on your background check is being used to penalize you, either a prospective employer is considering not hiring you, or a potential landlord has denied your application, or has taken some other adverse action. So things like charging you a higher security deposit based on your credit report, that would count as an adverse action. You have the right under the FCRA to receive more information about that. And so, as Jared mentioned a few minutes ago, the rules are a little stricter for employment background checks. So employers have to give you a copy of the background check report they got, and they have to do it before they make the decision not to hire you or not to promote you. Landlords don't have to give you advance notice before they use information on your background check to deny your application, nor do they have to give you a copy of the report. But if they've denied your application, you can ask them for the report. You can ask them why they denied you, and they may give you that information. But in both the employment and the housing context, you have the right to receive what's called an adverse action notice. And the adverse action notice has to identify the background check company that provided the background check. It also has to give you that company's contact information. And when you reach out to that background check company, as long as you do it within 60 days of getting that adverse action notice, the background check company has to give you a free copy of the report that they provided. And you can also request a file disclosure from them of sort of like everything they have on you. But really the background check that was used to deny you or to result in that adverse action, you want to make sure you get that as quickly as possible. Because once you have a copy of it, you can review it for errors, and you can reach out to the background check company to dispute those errors. Errors that you might see could include things like mismatched records, which is the sort of wrong person's records appearing on your report. It could be records that show the wrong outcome. So, for example, charges that were dismissed might still appear pending. Or you might have an eviction record that doesn't show that you paid, that the judgment amount was paid and satisfied. Another thing that might come up would be records that are too old to report. So this goes back to those time limits that I spoke of on my first slide. The collections information or eviction records that are more than 7 years old, they can't report that stuff. So if that stuff is appearing, then that's a problem. That's an error you should dispute. And when you contact the company to dispute the errors on your report, I think most of the companies should have a process that you can go through. They'll tell you what you need to give them. Often you have to provide a driver's license, a copy of your driver's license, for example, to prove that you are who you say you are. But you should also submit with that any supporting documentation that you have with your dispute. So things like court letters or court records or letters from prior landlords saying, you've paid all rent, you have a zero balance. That kind of thing is very helpful. The background check company generally has 30 days to resolve that dispute. They have to let you know how they resolved it. And you can request a copy of that updated report once they finished with the dispute. And you also have the right to ask them to send that updated report to anybody they've given the wrong information to. So I think it could be, the person you applied for employment with, or the landlord who denied your application for an apartment. You can request that they send it to those people as well. Next slide, please. So we know that we have thrown a lot of information out at you today. And I think Zach said that these slides are going to be provided. So you'll have access to this information after after today. But we really wanted to make sure that you know where to go to find not just the information we've given you today, but also a lot more information about these issues. And so this slide provides some links to guidance that the FTC has put out about these issues. The first thing is the tenant background checks and your rights. That is a recent educational piece that we worked on actually with colleagues at the CFPB, as well as DOJ and the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development. It walks through your rights when it comes to background checks for housing. So both under the FCRA and under anti-discrimination laws. It also includes links to different places you can get help with correcting a background check, or if you suspect that you've been denied housing because of discrimination. And then the next piece is called Disputing Errors on Your Tenant Background Check Report. That is actually a guide that the FTC published earlier this year that walks you through the process of how to get a copy of your background check report, how to review it for errors, how to dispute those errors, and what to do if that process doesn't resolve your issue. Employer background checks in your rights is similar to the tenant background checks in your rights piece. It just is for employment-related background checks instead of for housing-related background checks. And then disputing errors on credit reports is a guide similar to disputing errors on your tenant background check report. It just focuses on how to deal with errors on your credit report instead of on a tenant background check report. But the most important thing, I think, the takeaway from this slide is that link at the very top, the consumer.ftc.gov. That is the FTC's website for consumer education. And so all of these publications are going to be available there, but there is also consumer guidance on many other issues that we help consumers with. So how to avoid different types of scams, what to do if you think that you were the victim of fraud, so on. This is just a great resource if you need more information about any of these issues. Next slide, please. And then finally, we want to encourage you to tell us about problems with background screening companies or about other scams or frauds that you encounter. There's this slide includes a whole bunch of references, things like sweepstakes scams and callers who pretend to be from the government. But any of these or anything else, this is not meant to be an inclusive list. You can submit reports on our website. We have an English version and a Spanish version, and those are listed here on the slide. And then we also have a toll-free number that you can call. If you press extension 3, that will connect you. You can get connected with an interpreter. So, particularly if you have a loved one who doesn't speak English and who needs to submit a report through an interpreter, they can help them with that. And so when you use this website to report what happened, that report goes into a database that more than 3,000 federal, state, and local law enforcers across the country have access to. And the portal will also give you links to advice on what to do to recover from the fraud or from the scam, and also how to guard against it in the future. We know that not everybody feels comfortable giving information to the government. You can submit these reports anonymously. You can also work with an advocate or have someone help you, and they can submit the report on your behalf. But one thing I do want to note is that we don't resolve individual complaints at the FTC. So when you submit a report here, we use those reports to identify and stop dishonest businesses. We use the reports to investigate and bring cases based on those reports. We also use them to identify trends so that we know what scams to alert people about. All of that being said, because we don't resolve individual reports, we would also we would also encourage you to consider, if you're having an issue with a background screening company, either a credit report or a tenant background check or an employment background check, any of that, consider reporting that to our colleagues at the CFPB as well. Their process, in many cases, will result in them sending your complaint to the background screening company and the background screening company having to respond. So that can often help people get issues resolved more quickly. And I think Shayna is going to tell you more about that process in a minute. But for now, that concludes the FTC presentation. And I think we're happy to answer questions or there looks like there have been some in the chat as well. So.
Yeah, thank you, Whitney and Jared. This was incredible and incredibly dense. And I think for a lot of our viewers, including myself, when I first learned about all of this, also really infuriating. And I think part of it is because there is such conversation right now around clean slate, all things clean slate, cleaning all the slates. However, in light of what you just shared around background check reporting after the slate has been cleaned, allegedly, how is this kind of bumping into each other for folks? And I'll just tack on a follow-up for my own curiosity. If I go to court tomorrow and I get sealed or expunged, what should I immediately be doing from a consumer reporting lens to make sure that I'm safeguarded?
Jared, do you want to Do you
Yeah.
want me to jump in, or do you want to?
Let me take the last part of your question first, Zach, just while I think of it. But one thing that we have seen that can be effective, especially if consumers are aware of background check companies that are used in their area or by employers or landlords they do, which I know is a tall bar for many reasons we were just talking about, is affirmatively notify those entities of the sealing and expunging and provide those seal and expungement orders to them ahead of time. So if there are big ones that you're aware of, that can help to put them on notice. And we've seen that be effective. So you can often contact them, sometimes use their dispute process to say, I've got this order, make sure that you don't have this record. So that can be valuable, but we do appreciate people's time is stretched. And if you really are not sure, just make sure you have a copy of that record. So you have it as handy as possible if you were to see that record appear later on in a background check.
Okay, great. Thank you. Very helpful. And so I want to make sure that we have time to spend a little bit of time highlighting how folks can do what we're hoping that we will all do, which is complain, which is submit, which is enforce, which is advocate for ourselves. So Shana, I want to kick it back to you for just a couple minutes here to walk us through your complaint tool so that folks really can see how easy this is to stand up and say, listen, something's not right here.
Absolutely. And thank you so much. And there was so much in there on FTC's slides that was helpful to me too. So I think that, the more we are able to learn from each other, the stronger we all collectively are together. Before I hop into the complaint system and kind of how that works, I wanted to give you a quick heads up on a wonderful tool for those of us who are not necessarily financially inclined. Ask CFPB. It is a great resource. It's on your screen now, that helps you find information about so many different financial topics. If you're not even sure if it is a financial topic, but you know that you have a question where it might be an adjacent field, if it's insurance, whether it's consumer rights that are not necessarily, again, financial, put it in here, because those are all what you'll find is a number of hits, if you will, that come up that show verified, trustworthy, vetted materials. Some of those will send you right back over to FTC for some of the frauds and scams and reporting there. Others will take you to other federal agencies or other trusted, vetted resources. So I just wanted to make sure I shared that with you all. It's a great place to start, and you don't have to speak financial in order to make it work for you. So next slide. Submitting a complaint. I love the fact there were so many questions about how do I submit a complaint when I was talking earlier. And I know that those same questions came up for my FTC colleagues. What I think is really critical is that you're complaining, not just, like I said, for yourself, but for your community, for those that have experienced similar problems or issues. And so submitting a complaint to CFPB really helps to address the issue for the consumer, but also more broadly. So consumers can submit complaints on everything from credit cards and mortgages, bank accounts and services, student loans, one that often comes up for people who have been incarcerated, having student loans that have been outstanding for a number of years and might have gone into default or deferment. Vehicle loans or leases, payday loans, other consumer loans, including installment loans, title loans, etc., debt collection, money transfers or virtual currency. Believe me, we've had to get a lot more savvy on all of those things too. Prepaid cards, basically any type of financial service, you can put a complaint in. And so how does that actually work? The information you're putting in can happen very, very quickly. It's nice when you gather your documents ahead of time and you have them in front of you. On the phone, it can take as little as 10 minutes because we have folks who answer those phones from 8 to 8, 8 a.m. to 8 p.m., Monday through Friday, and speak over 180 different languages. So like I said, the phone calls versions can take about 20 to 25 minutes. Sometimes as long as 30 if it's particularly complicated. But having that documentation in front of you will speed up that process considerably. And then beyond that, if you're submitting online, like I said, you're basically entering all the fields that somebody would ask you if you had called in to our toll-free number. We also have services for those who have disabilities, hard of hearing, et cetera. So having those two options is incredibly helpful. The other thing that I want to make sure I mention is we do accept complaints that are submitted via writing and in paper form. So I know for folks who are incarcerated, we've put information out through entities like Prison Legal News on how to do that in handwritten long form. The challenge, of course, with that is that oftentimes those are incomplete. And so they require a lot more back and forth and follow up by writing, both for us and for the person who's incarcerated. But I think that knowing that you're not shut off from the rest of the world too, if you are incarcerated, that you are able to put them in via writing is also equally important. And we look at each one of those individually and work really hard to change it from, just a incomplete to a complete in every possible way. So that way we can get recourse for people who are incarcerated as well. So I think that's a really critical way of having your voice be heard. I love that Zach put it in the ticker at the bottom, that you're not just complaining for yourself, but you're complaining for the community. Very, very true. And so having all of those individual complaints add up and help us to understand what's going on is great for policy, but it's really important for each individual consumer because as either Jared or Whitney mentioned, that's one of the things we do is that we, when we get a complaint, we encourage the company, the financial institution, to resolve and complete that complaint process. So that way you're getting a response as a consumer. But I wanted to kind of walk through the life cycle of a complaint. So next slide, and I can do that for you. Then you can kind of see all that magic behind the curtain. Okay, so it all starts when a complaint is submitted. So say you submitted a complaint about an issue that you're having with a company regarding a consumer financial product or service. You will receive email updates and can log back in to track that complaint at any time, whether you submitted it by phone or by online web portal. A little more challenging, of course, when it's in writing, but there is a way to check it too, working with a correctional case counselor or something like that. But it's certainly a lot easier when you have either phone or email access. Second, we forward your complaint and any documents that you've provided to the company and work with that company to get a response from them. If we find another government agency would be better suited or better able to assist, then we forward that complaint to them and let you know. So if it's more of an FTC thing than a CFPB thing, then we would forward it over to our colleagues at FTC. Third, the company will then review your complaint, communicate with you as needed to resolve issues and answer questions, and then report back to you about the steps that were taken or that will be taken to taken on the issue, I should say, that you identified in your complaint. This is the key time frame. They normally have 15 days to respond. So it's a very short turnaround compared to calling the company perhaps and not getting an answer for days. So knowing that when you submit one to us, we help to work within that time frame of 15 days. We then publish information about your complaint, such as the subject and the date of the complaint, on our public consumer complaint database. With your consent, and only with your consent, we would also publish your description of what happened after taking the steps to remove personal information. So any bank account information, that kind of thing, your name, where you were incarcerated, any of those pieces would all be removed. But again, having the ability to access that complaint database and see what other people are saying about a particular financial product can be incredibly helpful and empowering to other people who might be considering that service. And then last but not least, we let you know when the company has responded. You'll be able to review the company's response, and we'll have 60 days to provide feedback about the company's response. So if it was not responded to you in a way that meets with your satisfaction, you could, of course, then re-respond to that complaint and say, this is what was not satisfying about the response, or that it was. It would be nice to get both types of feedback when an issue is resolved, to your satisfaction or to your dissatisfaction. And that, of course, again, is incredibly helpful in us understanding broadly what the issues are, but again, importantly, to getting your issue resolved. So that's kind of the short version. I know we have lots of questions and things that have been popping into chat, so I'm going to hand it back over to you, Zach, and we'll go from there.
Great. Thank you, Shayna. This is incredibly beneficial. And I think just to hear what folks can expect, I think also takes some of the mystery and maybe some of the intimidation out of what exactly happens when I go back to the government for help. But it is, in fact, just this simple. And having navigated a couple of personal friends through this very process, it is a very user-friendly one. And even if folks are just interested in exploring what happens and really want to walk that through, really encourage folks to do so. And I restated the comment that you made because it really drives home exactly why we wanted to make sure that this session was possible, which is that when we complain for ourselves, we are really complaining for our entire community. And I think that is huge. That is the headline of the day, Shayna Vanek. So thank you for that headline. I do have a couple of questions because I think there's a couple of threads that we didn't have an opportunity to tease out in the chat, but I know a lot of folks would be interested in hearing. One is just a couple more examples from Team FTC. You mentioned hidden deceptive fees as an example of something that's within your wheelhouse. Could you give us an example of what a hidden or deceptive fee might look like within the context of persons who are directly impacted?
So the rule, just so you know, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the things on the rule, but this is a preliminary rule. But I think I can give you an example that's sort of from the general concepts that I'll disclaim, however, this is not coming from our shop. So sure. If I a little bit off on the perfect details of what their great proposal is, please bear with me. But I know, for example, the rule is intended as it was proposed and is being considered to be very broad and cover all areas where fees might not be sufficiently described or disclosed as part of sort of a mandatory fee. And one example that I know they talked about in the paperwork of the proposed rule, very near and dear to this conversation, is that it would apply to fees that come up in the tenant space. So, for example, it would call it a deceptive practice and prohibit it for a landlord to tell you a one rental price when they were advertising or giving you disclosures about an apartment, when in fact you were required and had no choice to also pay an additional, say, concierge fee to have that in order to actually live in that unit, that you had no choice. So that would be a hidden fee. They would say you need to either make that part of the total rent, or if it's not part of the total rent, then that other fee needs to be for a something you could decline. So it can't be a secret actual part of the rent. The other flip side is if they do tell you that something is required and it is part of the rent, then they actually have to use it for the thing they claim it's for. So if they say it's a recreational facilities fee, then that money must actually be used for providing recreational facilities that must actually exist. So that's two pieces and ways that it comes up in the lives of certainly places I've experienced. I suspect a lot of you have all experienced where you get these added aspects in the rental context. So let me pause there. And it goes to many others in the more sort of commercial spaces, in the consumer and purchasing spaces. But I know that's one that caught my attention in thinking about the proposed rule. So it's very nascent. I mean, I'm hopeful, but I don't know for sure if it will come out in exactly that form. But that was one of the examples that they cited.
Okay, very helpful. Shayna, Whitney, anything to add to that in terms of things out of your shop?
Just one thing that I would add is, Jared flagged a couple of the rental housing type of issues that I think that the junk fee rulemaking is aiming to address. It is broader, and so think about sort of a bait and switch kind of thing, right? Where like they say the price is X, but it's really going to be Y because they're going to tack on fees. There are a lot of other parts of the economy where that may be an issue, and so I know another one that I think the rulemaking actually. The proposal actually asked people to weigh in on and to submit questions about involved things like short-term housing, so like Airbnbs or hotels, that kind of thing. And then I think there was also, I can't remember, there were a number of I can't remember. I don't want to speak incorrectly, but there definitely were a number of specific parts of sort of the way people purchase goods or services that it talks about. And, I think it would, it's both the misleading fees and also the hidden fees. And so it sort of comes at it from both aspects. So that's the only thing I would add.
Great. Thank you, Whitney. Shana?
Yeah, this isn't a fee issue, but I wanted to make sure I mentioned it when we were talking so much about rental screening and background checks. It was, I think, 2022 that any conviction related to a substance use disorder no longer could be considered when providing rental housing by landlords. So it's now considered part of the Americans with Disability Act and is something that is covered under the Fair Housing Act. So that's important because so many people have experienced significant issues with substance use disorders. And so that now no longer can it be considered as part of a reason to deny somebody housing. There's some caveats there. It's not my area of expertise by any stretch, but I think for folks who have criminal convictions that are specific to substance use disorder, that's an important thing to keep in mind and make sure that you know your rights there too.
Yeah, absolutely. And that raises my final question for the three of you. Whitney, I think it was you when you were sharing, mentioned that entities cannot have a blanket ban, that is not kosher. And yet
on
I know
criminal records, you mean on criminal records? Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. So could you share more about that? Because I know I still every day see rental applications and employment applications that clearly say no criminal convictions will be accepted.
So I am going to caveat this with none of us work for HUD, right? So this is really, and this is based on HUD guidance in the rental housing space. I think HUD guidance that came out several years ago in which HUD said you aren't allowed to have, I think it's that you have to do an individualized assessment of sort of the person in front of you. So you can't
much like we talked about with the EEOC last month.
Right. Yes. Yeah, it would be in the EEOC context as well for employment, that you have to actually, you can't say like no one with a criminal record is going to be allowed to live here. That being said, I think you're right. I mean, I think it happens all the time. And I think that, it is, my understanding is that would be a violation of the HUD guidance for a landlord to say no one with a criminal record should bother applying. But, again, like I'm not a HUD attorney, and so I don't want to speak for them, but Jared or Shana, I don't want to, do you have other thoughts sort of?
I will just note that it doesn't get into that level of detail, but just as a re-endorsement of the guidance, the consumer resource that we put out with CFPB and HUD and DOJ this past spring, that the link we shared, and it's in the slides and it's on the resources Zach has on your guys' website as well, has some rough guidance, not rough, it has some high-level ideas about when to look out for other discriminatory things in housing, and that's one of the goals, was to have that all in one place. So definitely take a look at that and how it suggests you think about whether to bring up whether a policy you hear about from a landlord can be discriminatory. Thanks, Whitney. Shana, sorry if I jumped on your comments.
You're good. You covered it.
So the final question, I guess, that I will kind of piggyback on there is, if someone has this type of issue that they would like to explore further, Shana, is this something that we can use the CFPB complaint tool to file a complaint regarding, or do we need to go the direction of HUD since this is a fair housing thing?
I mean, again, non-attorney speaking here, so I would call on my colleagues who are attorneys, but I think, putting in a complaint, if it does come through CFPB, then we would in turn share it with our federal partners as needed.
Excellent.
But I think it is partially a HUD driven and DOJ driven as well. But I think having any type of discrimination in housing, obviously HUD's probably the best resource to go to first. But that's my 2 cents. But we're happy to direct anything that comes our way that's not specifically in our wheelhouse, just in our care house.
And it does look like HUD, this is based solely on my Googling, right? 10 seconds ago, but it does look like HUD has a portal on their website for reporting housing discrimination. I can't speak to what their process is once they receive a report, but I do see that here, and there is a way to call someone and speak to them as well. So that may be the best place. I can post it in the chat. But that would probably be a good starting point in terms of getting HUD, to provide more information or to give you guidance on that issue.
And there is more information on that and links to those places to go and make a report or a complaint to HUD and DOJ in the tenant guidance that's both in the slides and Whitney just posted, and you guys have on your website, that joint guidance that tenant background checks in your right. So that'll tell you when to go to HUD and exactly where to go to them in normal formats. So definitely recommend that. And we like having it out there for that reason, that people can start there when they're in this situation. It also has links in it to the FTC's disputing errors piece and disputing errors on credit reports as well. So it's a good place to start if you're especially in the tenant background check space. Sorry, Zach.
No, you're fine, Jared. Thank you. And I just wanted to raise exactly what you already said, is that folks, as you're leaving this session, or as you are hopefully sharing the recording of this session with colleagues and clients and friends and family, know that both the CFPB's complaint tool and the Fair Housing complaint tool that we just elevated are both living in our resource library at any point in time. They work just as well on phone as they do on the computer, and really encourage you to dig into all of the resources that are in the consumer rights and protection section of our resource library. Again, it is, in my opinion, a really boots on the ground way for us to start leaning in and saying, no, this is not correct. I'm going to advocate for myself, and I'm going to use the tools that exist to help me create and enhance my own economic mobility. We want to keep our money safe in addition to earning more of it, of course. So we are running quickly out of time. This has been such a rich conversation, and I know that it has been helpful to those who were able to join in today. And I'm excited to share, for those who are still on the call, that this month in particular, we actually have 2 follow-up opportunities with the very agencies on this call today for us as JCC members to go back to these agencies and say, here's what I'm experiencing. And I've seen a lot of that already happening in the chat, which is wonderful. We have 2 formal opportunities for you to continue doing just that. And so again, if you have a colleague, friend, family who missed today's session, this Thursday, 2 days from now, the CFPB is hosting a listening session for folks who are directly impacted by the criminal legal system to bring forth the issues that we're experiencing, to inform more about what we hope that the CFPB will continue to look at in terms of enforcement and policymaking and protections. So I really encourage you folks to check that out. More information about both of these listening sessions will be distributed, because then 2 weeks from now, we will have the FTC back to talk about all things consumer reporting, fraud, all kinds of fun stuff. But the point, folks, is these are rare opportunities for us as people who are directly impacted, and those that we serve, to come right back to the table with an agency and say, here's what I'm experiencing. What do you got for me? And then I think that provides this ongoing around the table together that the JCC was really created about. And so I'm incredibly excited about that. Again, that is October 17th, and that's at 2 p.m. Eastern. And then again, October 30th, and that's at 12 p.m. Eastern as well. All of the information that you need for both of those events will be going out as part of this email. But folks, you do not want to miss these opportunities. And we'll get all of those instructions out to you as well to register. We discussed a wealth of powerful tools today. And while I continue to say that they live on the JCC's website and the resource page that will distribute the links afterward, the point is that we need to share them, we need to use them. And David, if you'll go ahead and pull up the last slide of our deck, I also encourage you folks to use the QR code that will be, there it is now, to provide us some feedback. You know, our hope is that we're bringing you resource-rich, informative content that allows you to move within your own economic ability in a more enhanced way. We want to know if we're accomplishing that vision, and certainly we want to know if the resources that we're providing are helpful to you, and if there are other areas that you'd like to explore. So please take some time and provide your feedback. As always, if you haven't done so, follow us on social media. And also remember to share the opportunity of the JCC with your circle. We will have programming like this every month, with the exception of a couple breaks in between. But this is what the JCC is all about, is this connection and this thought partnership. More ways to elevate your experience and your expertise are coming this month. And the table is always open to all. I'd like to thank each of our speakers again today. Thank you so much for making time to share your expertise, to share these resources, and for the passion that each of you bring to the space of enforcing and protecting the rights of directly impacted. I know that I can say personally, working with each of you has given me a new sense of my citizenry. I was one of those people that never felt like I could go back and I could get help and I could get these resources. And so to build partnership and relationship with each of the three of you has been a highlight of the last year and a half for me at this organization. And I really, really appreciate you being here. To our viewers, thank you so much again for joining us. Be on the lookout for those emails. We'd love to have you back for our 2 listening sessions. And we will be back again next month for our final edition of this year's speaker series. With that, we are adjourned, and I wish everyone a wonderful rest of your day. Thanks again, and take good care.